All right. Hey everyone, we are back for another episode of Coach versus Therapist. So my name is Ian Scott Cohen. I am a performance coach. I really work with people on refining their goals and achieving momentum and really just accepting themselves and who they want to be. And I have Scott Seitz, PhD, licensed therapist, clinical psychology degree here with me. Scott, how are you this afternoon? I guess it's the afternoon.
Yeah, doing great. I'm a fan of the Olympics, so that's been fun to kind of be engaged with over the past few days.
Yeah, I also get moved by the Olympics a lot when you see like achievement because these people have been working so hard, and I feel like we that resonates with a lot of us who are strivers for different things. But alas, we're here to talk about a different kind of media, and so today our topic is going to be tackling the social media habit. So really, the role social media plays for us, and the habit of consuming media on your phone, your devices and really, things like doom scrolling, a term that's thrown around a lot, stuff like that. Obviously, politics is polarized today. So a lot of us are just consuming a lot of media content. And so today, what we're going to talk about is the challenges and concerns that can come with that. And really, like what some data shows about the consumption of this stuff. Um, then we're going to look at why we do this. So why do we spend hours and hours a day scrolling on our different social media platforms, whatever your preferred poison is? And poison maybe is a strong word, but preferred habit is. And then we're going to finish with some strategies about how you can either edit this habit, limit it, shift it. There's a lot of different things you can do to make it something that works for you instead of kind of works against you. So with that, I thought I'd start by just kind of being vulnerable and opening up personally about what our social media habits are. So,
Yeah.
Scott, if you don't mind, I would love to hear what social media is your channel of choice, we'll say.
Yeah, so I recently have found myself mostly on Instagram.
Okay.
And what I've noticed recently for myself in terms of maybe bad Instagram habit is there'll be a period during the day or maybe after a work day where I will kind of like I'll open Instagram and just start scrolling. And then the next time I'm really like aware of myself, my surroundings, 30
Yeah.
minutes has passed.
Yeah,
And
totally.
during those 30 minutes, I could have been doing something that probably would feel more fulfilling, more satisfying, even more relaxing. We'll talk
Mm,
about that a little bit later. Like sometimes I think, oh, I want a break, quick little break. But then often it's not very relaxing. But anyway,
right.
so that's, I'll look up, 30 minutes has passed. I kind of feel like I'm in a worse place than I was before.
Totally.
And that's, I think, part of what we're here to talk about.
Yeah. So just Instagram, that's your main channel of choice.
Recently, yes. Yeah. In the
Okay.
past, it's been Facebook and some Twitter X, but over the past probably year, it's been Instagram.
Nice, nice. Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah, that's great because I actually struggle with Instagram in that I don't get on it enough apparently, and I'm trying to do that more for my own, business reasons. But also, my mom is an artist now, and she's on Instagram constantly, and she keeps sending me videos of huskies like doing jokes. And so mainly, I just need to get on there to see her latest artwork. She no longer sends it to me; she just posts and
Uh,
also because I need to get through that backlog of Husky videos. Anyways, so for me, I used to be on Twitter X, and that was like my thing. That was where I'd go. I'd have like 3 or 4 times throughout the day where I know I'd pop in there, scroll through stuff, and I'll get into a little later probably why I decided to get off of Twitter. Some of it had to do with the change in ownership and just the vibe on there changed, but some of it was very much intentional and personal. For me today, my channel of choice is Reddit. So I got on Reddit only like a year and a half, 2 years ago, I think, and I just Reddit is such like a crazy diverse place of stuff, which actually I think is one of the reasons why I prefer it to some of the other ones. In that, and again, when we get into the strategies of how you can use social media more towards things that you value, I'll talk about how I've done that with Reddit a little bit, although it's not perfect. But yeah, Reddit is my place right now. So we've got Instagram user, Reddit user, both former Twitter X users. We both probably used Facebook a lot before it became whatever you consider it now.
Yeah.
So we've got some experience on the podcast today. But where I want to start is the concerns around this stuff. So I think that a lot of us probably know innately to some extent, based off kind of what you were describing, these feelings, this like residue that you're left with after a session on social. And pop culture now has sort of informed us a little bit more about the negative effects of social media. But I wanted to actually look at social media's impact on children as a slightly different lens to help us all kind of understand the impact this can have on people. So I'm using a book called The Anxious Generation. It's by Jonathan Haidt, professor at NYU, I believe, big sociologist, and really great book. And he focuses all on Gen Z and the impact that technology, the smartphone, and social media has had on Gen Z. Now, before we get into the stats, because I assume most of our audience is not Gen Z, is probably older than Gen Z. We being millennials. I want to say why I thought looking at this issue through this lens makes the most sense. So first off, it's much easier to be objective and to kind of be open to new ideas and critiques when we're looking at other people versus ourselves. I
Yeah,
find
it's
that
not my problem. It's not something
right,
I
right.
struggle with.
Yeah, yeah, and it's a common practice in coaching where if someone's struggling with their situation, one thing you can ask them is like, okay, if a friend was in this situation, how would you advise them, right? Removing yourself allows us to get a little bit more objective. So that's reason one. A second reason is that as adults, I think, and especially if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably somewhat reflective already, but I think we have a greater awareness and appreciation for the impact that different factors and variables have had on our lives because we think back to our childhood, right? You think back to seminal events, different personalities, different influences. And I think as an adult, you recognize that actually habits, experiences, people can have a profound and lasting impact. So I think by looking at the Gen Z folks, that'll help us kind of solidify that in our minds and see how it contributes to us today. And the last reason I think focusing on Gen Z is that he has some great research, and it really is about how Gen Z has the heaviest dosage of technology out of any generation. The ones coming after them certainly would have a little bit more, but compared to us as millennials, who kind of we straddle that line, like pre-smartphone, pre-Facebook, to post. Gen Z never had that line. It's all social, all tech. So it's a pretty profound impact, and we can see sort of what an extreme looks like, and then recognize that while we might not be experiencing the extreme, there's certainly some similar effects. Do you feel like this is a good way to approach this from your perspective?
Yeah, I like it a lot. And to your point, how we as millennials kind of knew the world before tech and social media versus
Yeah,
after. I think in some ways we can also reflect on our own lives. Like, what did we used to do during those 30 minutes where we're now scrolling?
right. Yeah.
I mean, I was probably in middle school at that time, so things were a little bit different. But yeah, I like this idea. Let's look at the impact of social media tech on Gen Z to get some insight for all of us.
Yeah, and also I would say that a lot of us are either young parents or soon to be parents. So this will have and is having a profound impact on parenting too. And so the stats I'm about to share are real stats that are referenced again in The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. They are eye-popping, and I'll give some context as we go through them. The first one, so these are negative impacts of technology use and social media consumption. The first is teen depression. So a lot of the studies look at the changes in these different mental obstacles, challenges, whatever, between the years 2010 and 2020. And then they also talk about kind of post 2020 because we know 2020 was the pandemic. So some people think that that has something to do with this. I'll get to that in a minute. So the first thing is on teen depression. So since 2010 to 2020, there's been a 145% increase for girls in terms of teen depression. 145% to a point now where nearly 30% of teen girls experience depression. That is wild. And the increase for boys over that same time period, 161% increase for boys.
Wow.
They're not at the same like raw percentage total as girls, but still, that is an eye-opening increase. So depression is up. The
Yeah.
next is they looked at mental illness with college students. So things like anxiety, depression, ADHD, other things. They've seen 134% increase in anxiety for college students. Again, these are largely Gen Z students. 106% increase in depression and 72% increase in ADHD. And I actually think that last one is just as interesting and important as the others because one thing that more and more of us are realizing is the connection between technology use and our ability to focus our attention. So we'll
Yeah.
come back to that because that is certainly part of this conversation. So depression is up, mental illness in college students is up. They also looked at anxiety by age group. So 18 to 25-year-olds, that's solid Gen Z, 139% increase in anxiety. 26 to 34-year-olds. So I luckily am still a part of this group for 2 more months as a 34-year-old. 103% increase. So now we're getting millennial territory, right? Where we've got some of our teenage years and college years with smartphones and social. Then 35 to 49-year-olds. So these are getting closer to Gen X. 52% increase in anxiety. And then perhaps most telling, people 50 plus, only an 8% increase in anxiety. And, you're probably already thinking, why is that? It's because those people don't use the phones and social media like we do. Although I will say my mom and dad are now heavy social media users, it would seem. So we should just see what happens there.
Yeah.
So I've got a couple more stats, but I'll pause there. Any quick reactions to the rise in depression, mental illness, anxiety? Any quick thoughts from you, Scott, on this stuff?
Yeah, first is it is pretty incredible looking at those numbers in terms of the percentage increase. Another piece that sometimes people, when they look at change over time in mental health conditions, there's the concern of, oh, are we just more open to the realities of mental health challenges? And so are we like reporting more honestly, let's say, when people take surveys,
Yeah.
or are more people seeing therapists? But I think there's a few counter arguments. One is just these percentage increases are so huge
Yep.
that it would be unlikely it's due just to more or less stigma related to mental health.
Right.
Also, when you break it down by age, like you just did, if this really was kind of a cultural, social, there's less stigma for mental health, more people are seeing therapists, you'd probably see a more even increase across the age groups. But we're really seeing it highest among the youngest folks in our society, who are the ones who are using social media the most. Obviously, there's probably lots of factors that impact all of this, but I think safe to say, given the profound impact that social media technology has had on our society over the past 50 years, there's probably a lot that has to do with social media and tech.
Yeah, and I'm actually glad you brought that up because in his book, and actually when this book was released, there was a big article in either the Times or Wall Street Journal or one of those major publications about how the impact of social media was actually a myth. For that reason, their argument was that, oh, self-reporting is just up, it's also unreliable, and more people know about mental health, especially younger generations, they're more willing to self-diagnose and talk about it. And so Haidt takes this argument head on, and he's like, we certainly looked into that. And so he looked at some other data points, which I'm going to give you right now. So these are data points that are not based off self-reporting. These are actual events, incidences, rates, as you'll see. So the first one is they looked at the increases in self-harm in emergency rooms. So if a girl or a boy harms themselves for all kinds of different reasons, but what's the rate of that happening? And that, of course, is not self-reported data. That's reported by the hospitals as part of these different studies. And so over this time period, there's been 188% increase in self-harm incidences in emergency rooms for girls.
Wow.
188%. And for boys, it's 48%. So not as much as girls, but if that stat for girls wasn't there, 48% would also be considered significant.
For sure.
The other thing he looked at was suicide rates. Obviously, not a self reported stat here. A 91% increase in suicide rates for boys, younger adolescent boys, and a 167% increase for girls. And again, these stats tell us some sort of truth. And Scott and I both, for those who don't know, we both actually started our careers as teachers. So we both worked with students of different ages. So this is definitely personal for us as well. And I know for me, I've definitely saw some of this play out. I taught ninth and 10th grade. Scott, I think you were teaching younger age, correct?
Middle school, yeah.
Yeah. So right when this stuff was probably starting to, become a part of their lives. And so the last stat I'll leave you with before we get into kind of like the fundamental harms of this stuff, and then we'll get into why we do it as adults. So the last stat is that by 2022, 46% of teens reported that they are online, quote, almost constantly. And that is a crazy, crazy reality. A lot
Yeah.
of times we talk about, oh, like this idea of a metaverse and we're all going to live online. And there's a lot of people out there who tell us that we're already there, right?
Yeah.
Like think about you go from your phone to your laptop to your television, back to your phone to your laptop. And kids are doing this at a crazy rate to the point where when they're not looking at their phone, but it's in their pocket, they're thinking about it. There's one anecdote he has in the book about a girl who gets a notification literally once or twice a minute on her
Jeez.
phone. And as someone who naturally just does not turn on notifications, like I don't have that experience, but the experience of even just phantom vibrations on your phone, right? But these kids are checking it and are on it so much that almost half of them say that they're on it almost constantly. So that should give us, this is what the extreme social media habit can look like, right? And we know now from this data points that it's having a profound impact on young people. And he breaks down those fundamental harms for these young people into four categories, which I think as adults we can relate to. So, the four fundamental harms of this tech use, the first is social deprivation. So, instead of live in-person interactions and relationships, a lot of teen relationships are built online. And there's actually one of my favorite parts about the book is there's always been this sort of argument in favor of social media, saying that, well, it actually helps build social connection, right? It brings people community, especially people who are in underserved communities or underrepresented and need to find people who relate to them. There is some truth to that
Yeah.
anecdotally. However, he states unequivocally that he says he has never seen a study that actually proves with academic science and research that there is a positive outcome to social media. So I just want to
Mm.
put that out there. There's actually any studies that show this positive social connection everybody likes to talk about. So social deprivation. They're making less connections. They're interacting less in person. That has a lot of impact on relationships, which we can go into more detail because I think it's fascinating. So maybe we'll circle back to that. But social deprivation is one of those fundamental harms. Sleep deprivation. I think we all kind of intuitively and self-evidently know what that is. Attention fragmentation, right? So this idea of not only making your attention span um, weaker, but also just constantly making you think about your devices and what's
Yeah.
going on, those notifications. And then lastly, addiction. So a lot of teens and Gen Z get truly addicted to these devices to the point where removing the device from them can turn into a whole kind of ordeal. And so I share those to say, as you sit here and think about yourself and your social media habits and consumptions, do these four things apply to you? Scott, I'd love to use us as a quick, again, personal example. Do any of those four, social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, or addiction, resonate particularly for your personal life, your own personal use?
Yeah, I'll comment a little bit about the social deprivation piece because I do think that social media can be used in a way that actually promotes those social relationships. Like, if you are sending a few like funny things to friends and then you see friends in person and it like helps with the conversation and you feel a little bit connected to them during those periods where you're not seeing them. Like I think there, and again, it's anecdotal, but I've experienced some of that in a positive way.
Yep.
Um, but I do think on the whole, it's really easy to replace meaningful, close relationships with less meaningful connections with people online that we may not actually know.
Yep.
So I think that is a huge reality for many people. Um, I think the attention fragmentation for me is something that I have experienced where when I'm on Instagram, every time I move my thumb a few centimeters, I get this new rush of dopamine because it's something new and interesting and colorful.
Yep.
And then I can just flick my thumb again and I get another dose of dopamine. And so when I am in that scroll, it is harder then to get down and like start writing a report, let's say, if I've
Mhm.
got a report that I need to be writing. It's like my
Yep.
brain is seeking that instant dopamine rush
Yep.
that my report is not giving me, but social media definitely is. So I think that is one that I relate to the most.
Yeah, no, I love that. And it brings up a great point, and then that is, how are these products and platforms designed? This is pretty clear. There's been congressional hearings on this. There's been documentaries about this. The Social Dilemma on Netflix was a popular one. These platforms were designed to keep our attention because that's how advertisers on the platforms get seen. And that's why we don't have to pay for these platforms because we
Yeah.
give them our attention. They give that attention to advertisers, and advertisers try to sell us their products. And sometimes this can lead to buying things you want, buying things you like, right? Seeing stuff you find interesting.
Yeah.
But to your point, the platform itself is designed to hold your attention. I will say that I went on TikTok one time, a single time, one login because I was so curious. And I'm not like a Luddite. I like to explore new stuff. Like I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, the new platform, like I'm never going to look at it. But TikTok, I will tell you, I remember it vividly. I got on there and I look down, I'm scrolling through, and I look up, and I kid you not, it had been 90 minutes. I had been on there for an hour and a half, and I just because you just keep going, right? You keep going.
Yeah.
And to your point, like it's because it's taking advantage of how our brain functions. And
Yes.
it's just that quick stimulation, like what's next? Ooh, I gotta see what's next. Oh, maybe
Yeah.
one more. And then before
Yeah.
you know it, one more turns into 10 more, turns into 100 more, and you're still there. And literally tearing yourself away, pulling yourself out of that sort of gravitational pull of these platforms is really challenging depending on your state of mind, your energy level. So 100% agree with you there. For me personally, it's also why I got off of Twitter, because I felt like anytime I was on Twitter, I'd start scrolling and I found my thoughts speeding up. Like, it
Mm-hmm.
was sort of like a kinetic energy building to the point where
Mm-hmm.
it's like bang, 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 bang. And it became harder for me to slow down and methodically think through things
Yeah.
because I wanted to just get on to the next thing, get on to the next thing, get on to the next thing. And when you combine that with, the quality of content being manipulated by AI bots, and advertisers, of course, it just gets to this place where it's like, you start feeling this dull kind of like ugh feeling, and I'm losing some of the genuine enjoyment or connection. I do want to talk about social deprivation too because that also is something that's big for me. um, a thing that Haidt describes about what kids need when it comes to relationships and community, I think is really helpful for us as adults to think about too. He talks about the difference in physical community versus digital community.
Hmm.
how the expectations are vastly different. As humans, we evolved to live in small communities, right? You're physically there, you have your family and the surrounding families, and you're born into that largely. And so there's like a lot of physical expectations and responsibilities. And it was hard to jump into a new community, and it was very hard to leave your community. You're also risking a lot by leaving. You're risking
Yeah.
survival, security, all those things. The other thing that he talks about is that, when you see people regularly in person, you have a greater sense of responsibility to that person,
Yeah.
right? Because how you treat them and how they treat you and the give and take of those relationships matters a lot. It has consequences.
Yeah.
And that I thought was most fascinating when you think about the online experience. And the way he puts it is online, and using Gen Z as an example, they the barrier to enter a community is extremely low, and the
Hmm.
barrier to exit a community is also extremely low. To the point where now you hear stories about kids where they're like, "Oh, I unfollowed this person after they said something to me," or "They didn't
Yeah.
like my photo, so I'm going to unfollow them." The ability to back out of relationships, quote unquote, instantly for one, minor, maybe unconscious infraction, like not liking a post,
Yeah.
um, has made it so that you don't have that responsibility to the other people, and they don't have it to you. And so what you see is a lot of teens and young adults not developing that ability to wrestle with the actual messiness that comes with real human relationships.
Yeah.
And then they get in person and they don't really know how to handle themselves. That's why they're dating less, they're having less sex, they're not going out as much, they see their friends like I don't know, it's like 25 or 30% as much as we used to. Um,
Hmm.
and that has a real impact on human interaction and your ability to do that. I'm curious how that lands for you, and whether you feel that resonates for you.
Yeah. It's really compelling because part of what we learn and continue to learn in relationships is how do we navigate those difficult experiences.
Yeah,
We talked in the kind of last time that we spoke for a podcast about avoidance, and it's really easy to avoid those difficult conversations,
yeah,
even though they're important for building long-term meaningful connections. But so
yeah,
if I can just be upset with you and then unfollow you and literally never have to see you again, like block you on some
right,
format, I'm not practicing having that tough conversation to work through what was your perspective, what happened, okay, this
right,
was my perspective, how can we do it differently in the future?
yep,
And that stuff really does take practice, and part of it is also just practice being uncomfortable and having those, and
yep.
social media is a perfect setup to not get that practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And as someone who is, months away from getting married, um, my fiance and I have had so many ups and downs. It's just normal for a relationship. In fact, I would say it's necessary, right?
Yeah.
Like conflict is where vulnerability occurs and growth occurs, and you can get closer. And I'm really curious and a little worried for Gen Z. I'm curious to see how their relationship habits develop. Are they
Mhm.
able to form and maintain those relationships? Now, let's not go crazy here and say that the generations before us were masters of relationships either. Like
Mhm.
divorce rates amongst our parents and their generation are very, very high. But there's some of that too, where there wasn't a lot of expressiveness, there wasn't a lot of openness. Now we have that, but we're replacing the actual other parts, the physical intimacy, physical presence with this digital presence. And so it's a real challenge. And I really would press the listeners here to think about this in their own context, because the less you interact with people in person, the more anxious you get when you do that. And the less you're willing to date and kind of open up and experience hardships and adversity, setbacks, it just makes it harder long term. And so, if you want a lasting relationship or lasting friendships, to Scott's point, like it's really, you have to be able to wrestle with the back and forth, the ups and downs that come with relationships. And that is a responsibility that you have as a friend or a partner. And that's something that social media can actually deprive you of if you use it for social connection exclusively. And so let's transition, right? So we've looked at high level some data points about social media habits and the extreme impact they can have on teenagers and Gen Z, knowing full well that this is having similar impacts on us. It might not be as pronounced, but it is. We even have some data to support that. Now the real question is why? So if these things are so bad for us, why, oh why do we keep going back to them? And I think, I want to put aside the sort of I'll just call it the neurological reasons, right? So we accept and know that the platforms themselves were designed to take advantage of our brain functions. And so that's that piece. That's what the companies are doing. They know how our brains work. Now the question is like even when we know how our brains work, why do we continue to pursue these habits for ourselves? So let's start there. And Scott, I'd love for you to introduce the listeners to this idea of a functional analysis. I know that's a term from therapy and psychology. So what is a functional analysis, and what's sort of a context around it?
Yeah, in its simplest form, functional analysis is a fancy term for trying to better understand why does something occur? What is the function of this, let's say, behavior that we have? And part of the rationale behind a functional analysis is that we all do things for a reason. And it's usually a quote unquote good reason. Not to say that it's good for us in the long term, but it's a reason that makes sense
Mm,
for why we do it. So, if we're talking about why don't we have those hard conversations with other people? Well, it makes sense because short term, we're going to feel uncomfortable. That's kind of the function of avoidance typically is to not experience some of that distress, discomfort.
yep.
So I think what we're trying to get at is what is the function of engaging with social media? Why do we do it? In what way does it serve us? Even if
Mhm.
it's, a short-term benefit, let's say. Um, yeah, that's what kind of the overview I'd give a functional analysis.
Yeah, and this is really, really critical. And you can apply this to any part of your life. You think about your habits, what purpose do they serve in reality? Now, I want to just share a couple of things that we probably tell ourselves social media does for us, but I would argue largely is about deeper things than just these things. So you might tell yourself, oh, well, I like to stay connected to my friends, right? Facebook, Instagram, this is where my friends post. I get to follow what's happening in their lives. I comment and like on their stuff. And so it serves that purpose for me. We've already kind of talked a little bit about how the connection digitally is not the same as connection physically and in person, but we can dive a little bit more into this. A couple other reasons people commonly talk about is, oh, well, I go on social media so I can stay informed on current events, right? There's a lot going on in the world. I want to know what's going on so I can make sure that I'm taking action and, being a good citizen, whatever it is. It's for being informed. Another common reason is honestly, I actually just enjoy social media, right? I go on there and I'm fine spending my time there. And if that's true for you, that's great, have at it, right? Knowing that there are deleterious effects like anything else, you're obviously welcome to do what you want to do. But that is a common refrain you might hear from folks. It's just, I just enjoy it. And there is some enjoyment to get out of these things. There's no doubt about that. I just sent my fiance a video of a turtle on a skateboard going after a little cat because that is really cute and hilarious. She likes turtles. So I'm with everybody there. So those are the things we tell ourselves. So, Scott, let's try to take a functional analysis. We can either look at those examples or just in general and start to deconstruct some of the reasons why we think we opt for social media scrolling versus maybe other behaviors we might value more.
Yeah. To me, it comes back to what is the short-term function of it.
Mm,
And you mentioned earlier of kind of how these companies design these social media apps, platforms. And I don't want to kind of understate how important that is. In the short term, for our brains, it is interesting. It is engaging. We do get those dopamine rushes.
Right.
Um, and so it's very, very powerful. This is part of how addiction works, right? It's like the short-term impact. We might be struggling with alcoholism and really our entire life is crumbling around us,
Hmm.
but the short-term feeling we get as we drink alcohol, it sustains that behavior. And so I think that's a incredibly powerful function of the social media engagement that we shouldn't ignore. I also want to say that you mentioned some reasons why people state that they engage with social media. And it is true to some degree. Like you will be more informed about certain current events in some ways if you're
Sure.
engaged with social media. I think the question becomes at what cost? And is there a way to stay informed without as much cost?
Yeah.
Also, staying connected to friends. Again, there can be that benefit where we are able to laugh at a video together or talk about something we shared when we're in person, but it's when that becomes like the majority of our interactions. I think in some ways it's a facade, like it might make us feel
Mhm.
better in the moment, like it feels like we're connected, we think we're connecting, but
Yeah.
in reality, if we zoom out at the long term, we're actually not building those relationships.
Yeah. So I agree with everything you just said. And so let's talk about staying connected to friends because I think we need to start being honest with ourselves, right? And this is one of the biggest challenges is that which is great that mental health is talked more and more about today because I feel comfortable kind of digging into this a little bit more. So, let's say you go on Instagram, you see one of your close friends from high school who maybe you haven't connected with in a while, close friend from whenever, and you see that they posted their gorgeous wedding they just had. You're sitting there single, but you really, you're happy for them. You can be genuinely happy from seeing that moment. You like it. You comment, "Oh my God, it looks great. I hope you had an amazing time." That is not any sort of issue in my view, and I don't think anybody would argue it is. It's what happens next, right? Inside of our heads for a lot of folks. A lot of times you see things on social media, and this goes for LinkedIn too, by the way. I don't want LinkedIn to get us to escape from the discussion because LinkedIn envy is very, very real. Um, so what happens is you see that happen, and then a lot of times we use those things as sort of a bludgeon on ourselves to further the self-criticism that really plagues a lot of us internally because we're all sitting here also comparing where that person is to where we are, right? You see that person who has just married somebody and maybe you are single and have been trying to date and you're looking for a relationship and you haven't found it yet. And so what happens, you see that and then you use it to say, "Oh, look, another person's getting married. What the hell am I doing wrong? What's wrong with me? Obviously there's something wrong. I'm going to be lonely forever." And while that may sound extreme, I bet if you're listening to this, you have had those moments because we all have. It's something that we do, and social media can perpetuate this level of comparison. The same thing goes for LinkedIn professionally, where you see people, they're always announcing their new jobs, their new roles, or I'm in a lot of the startup spaces and work with founders. There's a lot of envy there. It's like, oh, somebody just raised $50 million for their round. Meanwhile, my startup can't earn 10 grand in revenue or can't get an investor on the phone. So it really, this envy that it feeds that we then use as a way to beat ourselves up. I think that's one of the big things that we need to talk about and really consider is when you're looking at your friends or your acquaintances, your colleagues, are you using it as a way to criticize and put yourself down?
Yeah. And I'll add that it can feel, even when we are engaging in that comparison, it can feel like we are being helpful or doing something helpful for
Mm.
ourselves because we can kind of convince ourselves that we're motivating ourselves
Right.
to work harder or to quote unquote be better, whatever that might mean.
Sure.
But I think the problem is that it actually ends up with us just feeling more down, and it's harder then to be motivated to do the kinds of things that we truly value and are important to us. So it can sometimes, like, our brains can trick us to say, this is what we need, like tough love. Look at all these people who live these happy lives and I'm miserable. Like,
Yeah.
get it together. But despite those good intentions, oftentimes it just leaves us feeling worse, and it's harder then to be motivated.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing I did a short video on a while back was around emotional comfort zones. And this idea that, and actually I sort of came across a concept similar to this in reading an author named Gay Hendricks, who's a sort of a renowned coach and popular psychology, and he talks about this idea of an upper limit problem. Everybody has one. It's just basically when you're feeling great, you inevitably find something or do something to pull yourself back down to earth and really like cut yourself off at the knees because our culture really breeds this sense of you're not good enough yet. You can be if you keep working hard, but you're not there yet, right? And I think there's an undercurrent of that in a lot of our religion, a lot of our economic systems. It's all there, and we don't speak about it enough. And I think when it comes to the social aspects of social media, there's a lot of that. And we honestly, emotional comfort zones, comfort is maybe a misnomer because it can be an emotional discomfort zone where you're just used to it, right? You're used to feeling down. You're used to feeling, self-critical. You're used to
Yeah.
feeling sad, and so you pull yourself back there because it's something you're used to. I mean, we all can get used to very, very tough conditions, and eventually you learn to love those conditions, right? Think about a dorm room. A dorm room is not a comfortable physical space to live in once you're an adult, but you make do as a kid or as a teenager or as a college student, whatever it may be, and you grow to really love that space, like your little nook over here. That's where you place your cup over here, right? Like we as humans adapt, and there's a beauty in that. But the challenge is we also adapt and get used to psychological spaces that don't feel good and we don't need to be stuck in. Like we're the guard holding the key to our own imprisonment there. So I really like that point about how this starts out as a positive and then twists itself into a negative. Let's talk about the second one that we tell ourselves, this idea that we're staying informed, right? So you're on social media to read the news because that's where we all get our news now. And I definitely fall into this camp. That is why I go on Reddit. Or at least that's where I start. I'm always like, let me read the news first. And then
Yeah.
I've earned my right to go over to the popular stream where I can see my
Yeah.
videos. But with the news, again, we know that media is in a very strange place now, right? And so I'm curious what you think about this tendency for us to always want to know the news, like what's the latest thing, and going to social media for it. What's your thoughts around that?
I think it varies per person in terms of like what's the rationale behind it. I think it can be nice to try to be informed about what's going on, have opinions. Um, but I think we need to be reflecting on what impact is it having on us emotionally, and is there a different way to engage with the news that's healthier for us. Another important aspect here is the news, unfortunately, I think over time and in the social media space, is also a business and looking for clicks. And
Right.
so we might be seeing headlines and reading things that are designed to have us experience intense emotional reactions and then click to learn more, designed to kind of like scare us, grab our attention. And so I think that can also be dangerous. It's still the news, but being thoughtful about what outlet am I using, and am I going to an outlet that is really intentional about presenting the news in a way that isn't really kind of playing with our emotions in order to get more clicks.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, clickbait is a very real thing, and considering your sources is obviously super important. And now I want to point out what we all know to be true is that most of us don't read the news. We read headlines. Most of us do not click on those headlines and read the articles. Instead, we sort of take an aggregation of the headlines to represent what news is out there. And I do this on Reddit. It's a way for me to kind of feel like I'm getting a pulse of at least what the internet's trying to tell me. But I also try to look at the sources, right? I know some like sources I'm just like, okay, that's clearly a partisan thing. That's clearly like, a sensational kind of outlet. Another thing that you'll see now a lot, to your point, is the words they use in the headlines. If I see another headline where it's like, you know, Kamala Harris slams Donald Trump, like the word slam is like really in. There's another one, it's like takes down or like claps back, and it's all this sort of like, ridiculous, almost reality TV like terminology. Whenever I see those terms, you just know that they're just trying to get you riled up. And the reason is, as a lot of us know already, that research is clear for these companies. When folks get riled up, and that can be in anger, it can also be in excitement and inspiration, but it's
Mm-hmm.
more often anger. That is when they're most engaged. And so that's why you see, and we've always seen now that we know this, posts that are people with sort of angry diatribes about politics or crazy conspiracy theories that get people really upset. Those are the things that take off. And it's because the research is clear when we are moved to that level of emotional intensity is when we're most engaged. We're most likely to like, comment, and so that's why you see that kind of stuff, right? And that's why clickbait occurs. And you can, we could talk ad nauseum about the media landscape and media's responsibility, but that's not really the point of this conversation. The point is to just acknowledge what is here and its impact on us. And so staying informed is a moving goalpost. Like, are you really staying informed? Is such I would challenge folks. Are you really reading into stuff? Because the other reason we use it for this is we want everybody has sort of an innate sense to want to belong to something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And being socially disconnected as we are now, as we talked about, your online presence is really where most of your day-to-day interactions happen. And a lot of us don't live in-person communities. You don't really have neighbors as much anymore. It's just a lot of residents. And so going and looking at news, especially if it's from outlets that you prefer and a political bent that you prefer, gives us a sense of that belonging. Like, oh, I'm tuning in today. I'm part of the army, right? Like, um, and I think that's another reason when we talk about functional analysis, part of this is about belonging. It's about feeling
Mm-hmm.
like there's other people out there who care about and think the same things you do and are getting as angry about it as you are. It's just important to remember that a lot of these outlets are manipulating that need of ours to get us to click on these things that may not actually be based off fact. They may be sensationalized. I shouldn't even say maybe. Most of them are. They purposely only give you one side of a story. And again, I'm not trying, it's not a political conversation. This is just more about how internet content works, especially with AI in it involved now. So that sense of belonging is another thing I think we're desperately looking for, and something we'll consider when we get into strategies about how to do this. So let's talk about this last piece of like enjoyment. Maybe I don't know if you have any quick thoughts on this before we get into the strategies portion of this conversation.
Yeah. I think if someone is like, hey, I go on to social media for an hour a day, I enjoy it, don't really care about these negative effects. Um, I would say like look at your life. Are you living kind of a life based on what's important to you, your values? And if so, and if that includes some like enjoyment for an hour during the day, why not? Right? Like we all get to make decisions. At the same time, I think we need to be honest with ourselves. Is it having some negative impacts that we either are okay with and we accept, or that on the whole, it's like, no, like maybe I want to enjoy myself, to relax, some leisure time in a different way without some of these negative consequences. For me, it's about choice. I'm a big fan of a rigid approach or like an all or none
Mm,
typically is not healthy or helpful. Um, that's not to say if someone's like, "Hey, I've decided social media is not what I want to do," like, I'm like, "Great, that sounds good." But I don't think it for every person a rigid approach has to be your answer. So that's my main thoughts on it. It's like reflecting on, sure, you might enjoy this. Are you being honest with yourself about the consequences, some of the negatives? And if so, are you accepting those and you're fine with it and still able to live the life you want? I say, great.
yeah.
Do you have other thoughts on that?
Yeah, yeah, no, I love what you said, and I think, obviously, we're all trying to design the lives that work for us. So there's no
Hmm.
one size fits all here. I think when I think about the function of it from an enjoyment standpoint, it makes me think a lot of escapism.
Hmm.
And we all like to escape from our lives and our daily stressors in different forms. I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with that unless it inhibits your ability to actually live and enjoy your present life.
Yeah.
I watch shows. I love shows. That's a form of escapism too. So there's certainly, valid value depending on what you yourself value. I think an additional question to consider is not whether it's right or wrong, right? I think there's a lot too much of like normativeness. Maybe that's not the right term, but to this kind of stuff, like no one's saying that it's good or bad to consume social media. I guess I would just say, how does it make you feel? And do you want more of that feeling or less? And is that feeling getting you closer to where you want to go or further away? Right. I
Yeah.
know for me, like have found a correlation when I was using Twitter that it was making me feel self conscious. It was making me judge myself and my work a lot more. And it was also just taking up a lot of time that I love to read, and it's like, okay, well, if I read for 10 more minutes instead of doing that, like maybe I'll feel differently. And I did, and that's why I did it. And so I really would just look from a very practical perspective. Like I think sometimes we get too heady about this, too philosophical. It's like your day-to-day life experience. How is this making you feel? And is that a feeling you want to continue? And what is it making you think? And are those thoughts helpful, right? So with that, I think it's a great transition to our kind of final section of this conversation, which is about strategies. Like, what can you do to, I'll just say, edit your social media habits to work more for you? And now we have a few different categories of strategies here. So we've got limiting strategies, we have some cognitive strategies, and we have some behavioral strategies. So let's just start with limiting strategies. I think those are probably pretty straightforward, kind of cut and dry. But tell us a little about limiting strategies, Scott.
Yeah. So this is the idea of we're cutting down how much social media we are using, we are consuming. Um, when we think about any kind of change to habits, people are different in terms of what works for them. Typically, people find it difficult to make drastic changes to
Mm,
habits. Now, if you are someone who can kind of cold turkey, cut out social media, that's what you want to do, great, go for it. I think for a lot of us, we'll experience that yo-yo phenomenon where we cut it out, then we're back in it, way too much, then we cut it out, then back into it. And so I think for limiting strategies, it's useful to think about what is a small change that I can make to limit the amount that I'm using social media, and whether that's I use some app that literally limits the amount of time I can spend on social media per day. That could be one example. Whether it's, hey, I'm going to just cut out one social media platform. And so I've got one fewer that I'm going to. It's a matter of figuring out what works for you. And if what you've tried hasn't worked, that's okay. That just means try something else to limit your consumption.
yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's literally in the term limiting, right? So other little things that I've done to help limit any habit really is just, physical spaces. Like thinking about and my fiance and I have talked about this recently. Like she I hope she's okay with me talking about her on this podcast. But she has attention issues at night, and we like to spend quality time together. And so she gets push notifications from her email because her email sometimes requires her to do some stuff at night. And so one of the things she had been doing was wearing her Apple Watch while we're, eating dinner and just kind of relaxing at the end of the day. And of course, her Apple Watch would ping whenever there was a notification for an email. And so, there's a very basic and simple thing you can do. And she's done it, and it's been wonderful. Where it's like, hey, workday's over. You don't need to wear that watch right now, right? Go put it in the
Yeah.
other room. Same thing with my phone is like I'll just put it in another room. Oftentimes I'll forget about it
Yeah.
and then I'll come back later. And the thing I've learned about social media is that it is always going to be there, right? It's like a river. I don't know if you've ever
Yeah.
stood at like a rushing river before and just looked at the water. I had this experience with some friends in Denver mountains once. We were at this really big river that was running down from this mountain, and you just stare at it, and we could have stood there for hours, and the
Yeah.
water never stops coming. Now, global warming aside, uh, I think you can very much think about the streams of information online in the same way. You can
Yeah.
walk away from that river, that stream of info, tweets, posts, whatever, videos, um, and come back a month later, and I guarantee it's still going to be running, it's still going to be there. And
Yep.
so once you realize it's like it allows you to understand it's like, the individual moments on there are fleeting and they'll be there again. Those emotions will be there every time. And so limiting doesn't mean you're going to limit your information necessarily or your enjoyment or your connection. It's more about just limiting this consumption of this thing that you're using for what you think are those things. And
Yeah.
so limiting strategies, very straightforward. Now let's get into the cognitive strategy. So like thinking about our thoughts and how we can, um, you know, approach our thoughts differently or tell ourselves slightly different stories, use different strategies there. So talk to us about cognitive strategies when thinking about social media habits.
Yeah, there's so much that we could get into. So I think maybe I'll focus it in on for people who find themselves really worrying after they engage in social media about what's going on in the world. That's not an inherently bad thing. Like we worry and we get anxious because in many ways that can be helpful, that can be productive.
Yep.
Um, we've got to look out for, though, when it gets to rumination, the idea of like we're worrying in a way that is not leading to anything productive. So it can be questions like, why me? Or this isn't fair, or things that just keep us in loops, kind of
Yep.
thinking loops. And although there's lots that could be said here, I think one helpful question is, hey, what's one thing that actually is in my control that I can do related to this topic? Like if you really are worried about something that you've seen through social media, ask yourself, yeah, what's something in my control that I can actually do related to this? And doing it can give us a little bit of a boost in self-efficacy, make us feel like we've got a little bit of influence, power, control, and get us out of that kind of continual worry loop that sometimes social media can trigger.
Yeah, no, I love that. This idea of like being productive with how you're worrying is definitely a concept that's helpful. And I would add to that, try to look at certain issues. So let's say you see posts about global warming, right? And some very, very stark and terrible reports coming out about that. And that obviously can drive a lot of us to this existential worry. And I think another thing you can do is really try to look at it from like an objective like researcher standpoint, like a curiosity is a cure for a lot of things. And I think when we're talking about especially being on the internet, you can get curious about these things and try to dig deeper into learning about the thing itself as opposed to worrying about it. You could learn about it, and I always think learning can be a productive activity. Oftentimes you can understand the nuances. I mean, Why are these things happening? What are all the different details that I probably don't know?
Yeah.
Why isn't it easy to fix global warming or fix this issue? Because there's a lot of stuff involved, and the more you dig in, the more informed you get. But it also lowers the temperature a bit because you realize, one, there's a lot of people working on these issues already, and they're doing a lot of research, and there's a lot of different things to understand, which I actually find comforting. Right? That doesn't
Yeah.
mean I want to, eschew all responsibility, but I do find it comforting that people are working on it and that I can tap into their work to understand it.
Great
Um,
point.
so using learning, I think, is another way, or trying to view the activity you're doing as a way to, oh, you know what, I'm learning about this issue. It's might be worrying me because of the consequences, but to your point, that's sort of outside of my control typically. And so let me view this as a learning exercise. So I think that's really great for cognitive strategies. So we talked about limiting strategies, how you little ways you can limit your consumption, of course, cognitive strategies. Let's close with some behavioral strategies. And if you could actually tell us first the difference between cognitive and behavioral strategies here is sort of just a basic setting the scene, and then we'll dig into the behaviors.
Yeah, so cognitive strategies are really focused more on our thoughts. There's the, I think, useful phrase of, we don't respond to things that happen or events. We respond to our perspectives on those things or our events. Like our world really is funneled through our thoughts. So that's the cognitive side. Behavioral is just really about like, what are we doing? If you think about like our body, our limbs, what we actually do. Um, that's the behavioral realm. And I think one thing that you mentioned related to, yeah, if you notice yourself worrying, one thing you can do is go learn about the topic that you're worrying about. And so whether that is like seeking out articles and actually reading articles about a
Whoa,
topic.
whoa, whoa. It sounds like homework. I don't want to read anything.
Yeah, or honestly, if you're like me, listening to a podcast about something, because I'm in the who's gonna sit down and read something? I think Ian, you're way more likely to actually do that than I am.
That'll be a separate podcast about reading and the lack of
Yes,
it happening.
yes.
Um, yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so one thing I did with Reddit, which I kind of alluded to in the beginning, was I forgot, and this sounds silly when I say it out loud, but this happened with Twitter. I forgot that I controlled who I followed. Like you just get
Hmm.
so used to your feed
Yeah,
that I personally, and I could be very much in the minority here. I don't really know. I forgot that I could unfollow people. I forgot that I could go and follow new people. And so I really just forgot that I had some control over the algorithm.
yeah,
And with Reddit, what I do like about it is that there's a lot of subreddits that are very specific to things that I find really interesting. So, for instance, a part of my feed are the latest cool science discoveries that come out and breakthroughs. So I was trying to think of an example. I was reading the other day about a new blood test that has like a 90% accuracy rate for identifying Alzheimer's early. It's like, okay, that's really cool.
yeah,
Or a new cancer treatment that's shown amazing results in early melanoma patients. So by reading those articles, I'm reinforcing to Reddit's algorithm that I like that stuff. I can follow those subreddits. And now to me, that's stuff that I value. I value that knowledge, science, technology I find interesting. It's rarely political in any way either, so it doesn't really mess with my emotions much. So don't forget that you actually can have a huge effect on what you're consuming by spending more or less time on certain things. I will say, again, admission, I'm a Game of Thrones fan, and my Facebook feed is hilarious because it's like five of my relatives and a couple friends, and then it's all Game of Thrones graphics about like the size of dragons and the different characters. But
yeah,
you can see the impact of your behavior on these algorithms, which is what makes them so powerful. And so to your point, I think, again, approach this from a learning perspective, saying, let's say you see an issue or you see something about a candidate or whatever it is, like challenge yourself to go and read an article about that person. or read their Wikipedia page, because Wikipedia today is almost sort of this oasis of neutrality in some ways, compared to a lot of media outlets. And so, diving deeper and actually appreciating the knowledge that comes from the internet, I think is a huge thing that we're slowly forgetting, unfortunately. It is the greatest library ever, created by man, and so there's a lot out there. Same thing with
Yeah.
Gen AI now. Like some of this stuff, if you see an issue online that you're really interested about, you can go to ChatGPT and have a conversation with it about that issue, and it'll give you some pretty solid info. I was messing around with it the other day. I was like, "Hey, if I wanted to learn all about biotechnology, like design me a course," and it can put together a whole syllabus for you and like
Yeah.
assignments and things like that. So we're fortunate to have these tools available now that can satisfy our need for doing something and sort of escaping or getting our minds on something, but use it in a way that you might find more value and more productive.
Absolutely. And I'll end with one more idea under this behavioral umbrella. And it's the idea of social media is, in many ways, working to at least help us feel like it's addressing certain needs we have, like being socially connected. And so if you're recognizing that, oh, like I'm kind of using social media because I want to be socially connected, great. You can send some like memes to friends and whatnot, but then also make sure you're following up and spending time with friends or doing whatever else is important, valuable to you outside of social media. So even if it's just, hey, I had some fun, like sending some memes to you, Ian, like giving you a call and talking on the phone, like
Whoa, whoa,
that's,
whoa, talking.
I know I'm talking wild here, but that's another example of how long term those kinds of social connections, social relationships are meaningful to us. But it's a matter of it, like if it just exists in the social realm, often it's not going to be that meaningful connection that we're really seeking.
Right. Yep. Yeah, 100%. I think, to put a bow on everything, it's, again, when we're talking about social media, there's a lot of things it does for us, but part of this, what's important is recognizing why you're using it in the first place, and are you actually getting the value out of it that you hope for,
Yeah.
right? Like looking at a functional analysis, like when do I go to it? Why do I go to it then? And is it serving me? Is it making me feel better? Is it making me grow in a positive way? Or is it I'm using it as a way to put myself down? Am I using it in a way to make myself angry? Am I using it in a way to make myself upset? If you find yourself leaving a social media session feeling upset or angry or self-critical, I would challenge you to really think about whether it's a healthy habit for you to continue, and challenge yourself to take a 1 day break or do it for 10 minutes less. Like a lot of this is just small steps that alter your day-to-day life. We're not talking about, moving across the globe or anything like that. It's just finding something else to do for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. I think that's a great place to start. But at the end of the day, this is about you making sure you're serving yourself with the things you spend time on. And social media, for a lot of us, turns into a more harmful versus helpful activity. So, with that, Scott, as always, thank you for your perspective. We covered a lot of ground here today. I was very excited about this conversation. I think we talked about a lot of great stuff. And I will put a link to this Jonathan Haidt book, The Anxious Generation, into the show notes. And until next time, we appreciate you listening to Coach versus Therapist, and we will hopefully see you guys again in the future.
Thanks, y'all.